Sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with bullets, but with trust, and the strongest bonds are forged in the fires of adversity, honor, and true love. The scorching Monday sun blazed over Red Rock's Main Street as Sheriff Jacob Johnson made his routine patrol. Dust swirled around his boots while he checked the hitching posts outside Murphy's General Store. The town seemed peaceful, with only Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry and old Pete sweeping his porch. Jacob tipped his hat to the schoolmarm heading to the First National Trust Bank. Little did he know that 3 masked riders had been watching the town since dawn, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Gunshots erupted from inside the bank, shattering the Monday morning calm. Sheriff Johnson drew his Colt and rushed toward the commotion. 3 armed men in bandanas burst through the bank doors, dragging cashier Samuel Whitmore and young schoolteacher Mary Collins as hostages. "Nobody move or they die," shouted the leader, a burly man with cold gray eyes. The bandits backed toward their horses while keeping their captives between them and any potential threats from the gathering crowd. Jacob positioned himself behind the water trough outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, trying to get a clear shot without endangering the hostages. "Let them go and we can talk," he called out. The leader laughed harshly. "Ain't nothing to discuss, Sheriff." As Jacob moved for a better angle, the tallest bandit swung his rifle butt with brutal force. The wooden stock connected with Jacob's temple, sending him crashing to the dusty ground, blood streaming from his head wound. 20-year-old Annie Johnson dropped her telegraph forms and rushed to her uncle's side as the bandits mounted their horses and thundered out of town. "Uncle Jacob! Someone get Doc Thorne!" she screamed, cradling his bloodied head. Dr. Elijah Thorne arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand. After a thorough examination, his face grew grave. The blow caused severe trauma. "He's alive, but it'll be at least a month before he can resume his duties," he announced to the worried crowd gathering around their fallen sheriff. Mayor Horace Blackwell urgently convened the town council in the Silver Dollar Saloon, since the only proper meeting hall had burned down in last year's fire. The oak table was surrounded by worried faces. Dr. Thorne, hotel owner Mrs. Rosamond Fairfax, rancher William Montgomery, and banker Theodore Mills. "Gentlemen, we need a temporary sheriff immediately," Blackwell declared, wiping sweat from his brow. "Those bandits might return, and we have no law enforcement." The room buzzed with concerned murmurs as they considered their limited options in the frontier town. Annie Johnson stepped forward from the corner where she'd been quietly listening. "I volunteer to serve as temporary sheriff," she announced, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The room fell silent. Rancher Montgomery scoffed loudly. "Miss Johnson, this is men's work. You're just a telegraph girl." Annie's green eyes flashed with determination. "I studied law at the Eastern College before returning home. I know the statutes better than most men in this room, and I'm not afraid to use a gun when justice demands it." Dr. Thorne stood up, adjusting his spectacles. "Annie has more education than anyone here, and she's got Johnson courage in her blood." Mrs. Fairfax nodded vigorously. "I second that motion. This girl has a sharp mind and steady hands." Despite Montgomery's continued protests about propriety and tradition, the council voted 4-1 in Annie's favor. Mayor Blackwell solemnly handed her the sheriff's badge, its silver star catching the lamplight. "You understand the gravity of this responsibility, Miss Johnson?" Annie knelt beside her unconscious uncle's bedside in Doc Thorne's clinic, placing her right hand on the family Bible. "I, Annie Johnson, do solemnly swear to uphold the law and protect the citizens of Red Rock," she declared. Doc Thorne administered the oath while Mayor Blackwell witnessed. She pinned the star to her brown cotton dress and accepted her uncle's Colt 45 with trembling but determined hands. "My first priority is tracking down those bandits and ensuring the safety of our witnesses," she announced, already formulating her plan of action. The next morning's dawn brought an exhausted horse stumbling into Red Rock, its rider swaying dangerously in the saddle. Annie looked up from her morning patrol to see a tall, dark-haired man in his 30s slide from his mount near the white-painted church. Blood stained his torn shirt sleeve as he collapsed onto the dusty ground. Behind him on the horizon, 3 distant riders sat motionless on a ridge, watching through field glasses. The stranger's horse stood with heaving flanks, foam around its bit, clearly pushed to its limits during a desperate flight. Annie rushed to the fallen man's side, her new badge glinting in the morning sun. "Mister, can you hear me?" she asked, checking his pulse. Luke Cassidy's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing deep blue irises clouded with pain and exhaustion. "They're coming," he whispered before losing consciousness again. Annie noticed the significant bullet wound in his shoulder and the leather saddlebag still attached to his horse. Her instincts as the new sheriff kicked in. This could be connected to yesterday's bank robbery. Dr. Thorne helped Annie carry the unconscious stranger to the jail's single cell, where they could treat his wound while keeping him secure. As Annie searched his saddlebags, her heart sank when she discovered several bundles of cash wrapped in bank paper. "This looks like money from our robbery," she told Doc Thorne grimly. Outside, the three mysterious riders had moved closer to town but remained at a distance, clearly watching the jail building. Their presence confirmed Annie's suspicions that this wounded man was somehow involved in yesterday's crime. When Luke regained consciousness hours later, he found himself behind iron bars with his shoulder bandaged. Annie sat nearby, her uncle's Colt resting on her lap. "Name's Luke Cassidy," he said weakly, noticing her sheriff's star. "I know how this looks, but I'm not one of the men who robbed your bank." Annie studied his weathered face, noting the sincerity in his eyes despite her suspicions. "Then explain the money in your bags and why those riders are watching my jail," she replied firmly, determined to get the truth. Over the next 3 days, Annie tended to Luke's fever while he drifted in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, he began sharing fragments of his story. "I was working cattle on the Morrison Ranch in Arizona Territory," he explained weakly. "Overheard 3 men planning to hit your bank. Their leader called himself Iron Jack Morgan." Annie listened carefully, noting the calluses on Luke's hands that spoke of honest labor. His fever-induced rambling seemed too detailed and consistent to be fabricated lies. "I tried sending a telegram to warn your sheriff," Luke continued during one of his clearer moments, "but realized the gang had already left, so I rode hard to get here first." Annie brought him water and checked his bandages. "Why would you risk your life for strangers?" she asked. Luke's blue eyes met hers with startling intensity. "Because it was the right thing to do. I've seen what men like Morgan do to innocent folks." His voice carried a weight of past experiences that made Annie believe his sincerity. As Luke's strength gradually returned, he explained how he'd tried to protect the hostages during the robbery. "I couldn't stop them, but I managed to grab some of the stolen money when Morgan's man shot me. Figured it might serve as evidence." Annie found herself drawn to his quiet courage and moral conviction. She noticed how he never complained about his pain and always asked about her uncle's condition. The 3 watchers outside had disappeared, but Annie remained cautious about Luke's true identity and motives. "You don't believe me," Luke observed during Annie's evening visit to his cell. She hesitated, torn between her growing trust and her duty as sheriff. "I want to believe you, Mr. Cassidy, but I need more than just your word." Luke nodded solemnly. "I understand. A sheriff has to be careful, especially a young woman proving herself to skeptical townsfolk." His respectful acknowledgement of her position surprised Annie. Most men either dismissed her authority or challenged it directly. This stranger seemed to genuinely respect her role as law enforcement. A week of caring for Luke had created an unexpected bond between them. During quiet evening hours, they discussed books Annie had read at college and Luke's dreams of owning his own ranch someday. "I never met a woman who could quote Shakespeare and handle a gun equally well," Luke admitted, with genuine admiration. Annie felt her cheeks warm at his compliment. "And I never met a man who listened to my opinions without trying to change them," she replied. Their conversations revealed shared values about justice, honor, and the importance of education. When Annie changed Luke's bandages, their hands accidentally touched, sending unexpected warmth through both of them. "You have gentle hands for a sheriff," Luke said softly, his blue eyes holding hers longer than propriety suggested. Annie quickly pulled away, flustered by the intensity of her feelings. "I should maintain professional distance," she murmured, though her heart raced. Luke nodded respectfully, but she noticed how his gaze followed her movements around the cell. The attraction between them was becoming impossible to ignore. "Tell me about your life before this," Annie found herself asking during one of their talks. Luke described growing up on a small farm, losing his parents to fever, and working various ranches across the territory. I've been alone most of my life, he said quietly. What about you, Sheriff Johnson? Annie shared her Eastern education, her return to help family, and her dreams of bringing progress to frontier towns. You're remarkable, Annie, Luke said, using her first name for the first time. The intimacy of it made her breath catch. Town gossip began circulating about the unusual relationship between their young female sheriff and her prisoner. Mrs. Henderson whispered to Mrs. Murphy about the long hours Annie spent at the jail. It ain't proper, she declared. Annie overheard the talk but found herself caring less about propriety and more about Luke's welfare. When she brought him dinner that evening, Luke gently touched her hand. Thank you for everything, Annie. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for your kindness. The tenderness in his voice made her realize she was falling in love with this mysterious stranger. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the arrival of 3 riders bearing federal badges. Marshal Nathaniel Craig, a stern man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes, dismounted outside the jail with an arrest warrant in his weathered hand. Sheriff Johnson, I'm here for Luke Cassidy. He's wanted in connection with a series of robberies across the territory. Annie's heart sank as she read the official document. Marshal, I believe there's been a mistake. This man tried to prevent our robbery, not participate in it. Craig's expression remained unmoved by her protests. Miss Johnson, I respect your position, but federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority in this matter, Marshal Craig stated firmly. Cassidy will be transported to Tucson for trial. Annie felt desperate as she watched Luke's face through the cell bars. He showed no surprise at the warrant, only resigned acceptance. Don't risk your career for me, Annie, Luke said quietly. I knew this day might come. But Annie couldn't accept this injustice. She had to find a way to prove Luke's innocence before Craig took him away from Red Rock forever. That evening, Annie paced her small office, wrestling with her conscience. She had grown to love Luke, but more importantly, she believed in his innocence. As darkness fell, she made a decision that could destroy her career. Taking the jail keys, she approached Luke's cell. I'm giving you a chance to escape, she whispered urgently. Luke shook his head firmly. I won't make you an accomplice to my crimes, real or imagined. If I run, it proves their case against me. His nobility only made Annie love him more desperately. Marshal Craig planned to depart with Luke at first light, accompanied by his 2 deputies for security. Annie spent a sleepless night on her knees in the small church, praying for divine intervention. She couldn't bear the thought of Luke facing trial for crimes he didn't commit, especially when the real perpetrators remained free. As dawn approached, she resolved to make one final plea to the marshal, hoping that somehow, some way, the truth would emerge before it was too late. Her heart ached with the possibility of losing Luke forever. Word of Luke's arrest and the federal marshal's arrival had spread across the territory like wildfire. Jack Iron Morgan received the news from a drifter in a saloon 50 miles away. That witness is still alive, he growled to his remaining men, Tom Rollins and Frank Dobson. If he talks to that marshal, we'll all hang. Morgan's scarred face twisted with determination. We ride back to Red Rock tonight. Dead men tell no tales. The 3 outlaws prepared for their most dangerous mission yet, attacking a town with federal law enforcement present. Annie noticed suspicious movement on the ridge overlooking Red Rock as she made her morning rounds. 3 riders sat motionless among the rocks, studying the town through spyglasses. Her sheriff instincts immediately recognized the threat. She rushed to warn Marshal Craig, who was preparing Luke for transport. Marshal, we have company on the northern ridge. I believe it's the real bank robbers. Craig squinted through his own field glasses and cursed under his breath. You're right, Sheriff, they're planning something. The lawmen began preparing for an attack. Samuel Whitmore, the bank cashier who had remained silent since the robbery, finally approached Annie with trembling hands. Sheriff Johnson, I need to tell the truth about what happened that day, he said, his voice shaking with fear and guilt. That man in your jail, Cassidy, he tried to protect Miss Collins and me during the robbery. He fought against the bandits, not with them. Annie's heart soared with vindication. This testimony could change everything, but she noticed the gang was already moving closer to town. Marshal Craig listened to Whitmore's confession with growing interest, but his attention kept shifting to the approaching riders. This changes the situation regarding Cassidy, he admitted to Annie, but we have immediate concerns. That gang means to silence their witness permanently. Annie felt torn between relief at Luke's vindication and terror at the coming violence. Marshal, they're not just after Luke. They'll attack anyone who can identify them. Craig nodded grimly, checking his weapons. Then we make our stand here in Red Rock. Send word for all able-bodied men to arm themselves. Dawn's first light brought the thunder of hoofbeats as Morgan's gang charged down Main Street, firing wildly at windows and doorways. Annie quickly unlocked Luke's shackles and pressed her uncle's spare rifle into his hands. "Can you fight?" she asked urgently. Luke nodded, testing his wounded shoulder. "For you in this town, I'll fight through anything." Marshal Craig positioned his deputies behind overturned wagons, while townspeople barricaded themselves indoors. The battle for Red Rock had begun with bullets splintering wooden storefronts and shattering glass windows throughout the settlement. The gunfight raged for what felt like hours as the gang tried to flush out their targets with burning arrows shot into building roofs. Annie demonstrated remarkable marksmanship with her rifle, forcing Frank Dobson to take cover behind the water trough. Luke, despite his injuries, proved himself a capable fighter, his shots precisely placed to wound rather than kill. "You're quite the marksman," Marshal Craig called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "Too bad you're on the wrong side of this warrant." Annie shouted back. "He's on the right side now." Tom Rollins managed to flank their position and aimed his rifle at Annie from the alley beside Murphy's store. Luke spotted the danger just in time and threw himself between Annie and the outlaw's gun. The bullet meant for her tore through Luke's leg, sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. "Luke!" Annie screamed, dropping beside him as blood soaked through his pants. Marshal Craig witnessed the sacrifice and finally understood Luke's true character. "Any man who takes a bullet for a lady sheriff is no outlaw," he declared firmly. The tide turned when local ranchers and shopkeepers joined the fight, surrounding the remaining gang members with determined gunfire. Frank Dobson, wounded in the arm by Annie's precise shot, dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Tom Rollins, bleeding from Luke's bullet wound in his shoulder, also threw down his guns when faced with overwhelming odds. Only Iron Jack Morgan escaped, spurring his horse toward the mountains with angry shouts about revenge. The people of Red Rock had successfully defended their town, but at the cost of considerable blood and property damage. Marshal Craig officially dropped all charges against Luke Cassidy based on Samuel Whitmore's testimony and Tom Rollins' detailed confession about the gang's crimes. "Mr. Cassidy, the territory of Arizona owes you an apology and its gratitude," Craig declared as Doc Thorne bandaged Luke's fresh leg wound. The marshal also announced a substantial reward for Luke's assistance in capturing members of Iron Jack Morgan's notorious gang. Annie felt overwhelming relief as she watched the federal warrant being torn up and burned in the jail's small stove. Sheriff Jacob Johnson returned to duty 3 weeks later, his head wound healed but leaving a permanent scar above his left temple. He found Annie organizing the paperwork from the gang's capture with meticulous care. "You've done the Johnson name proud, niece," he said, embracing her warmly. "The whole territory's talking about Red Rock's Lady Sheriff." Annie smiled as she unpinned the star and handed it back to her uncle. "It belongs to you, Uncle Jacob. I was just keeping it safe." But the respect and admiration in the townspeople's eyes remained firmly fixed on her. Luke decided to remain in Red Rock to help track down Iron Jack Morgan, who had escaped into the mountain wilderness. The bounty on Morgan's head was substantial, and Luke's knowledge of the outlaw's methods made him valuable to the ongoing investigation. "I've got nowhere else to be," Luke told Annie as they walked along the dusty main street. "Besides, this town grows on a man." Annie's heart fluttered at the implication that he might be staying for reasons beyond just the manhunt. The townspeople had embraced him as a genuine hero. The people of Red Rock organized a celebration dinner at the Silver Dollar Saloon to honor their defenders. Mayor Blackwell made speeches praising Annie's courage and Luke's sacrifice, while Mrs. Fairfax prepared her finest meal for the occasion. Doc Thorne raised a toast to Sheriff Johnson, who proved that courage has no gender, and to Luke Cassidy, who showed us that heroism comes from character, not reputation. As the evening progressed with music and dancing, Annie and Luke found themselves drawn together, their shared trials having forged an unbreakable bond of trust and affection. A month after the battle, Sheriff Johnson offered Luke a permanent position as Deputy Sheriff of Red Rock. The town needs someone with your experience and character, Jacob explained, extending his hand in friendship. Luke accepted gratefully, understanding that this opportunity represented a fresh start and a chance to build the respectable life he'd always dreamed of. Annie returned to her telegraph duties but also began assisting with legal matters, her Eastern education proving invaluable to the growing frontier community. The arrangement pleased everyone, especially the young couple who could now work together openly. One evening, Luke asked Annie to walk with him along Salt River, where cottonwood trees provided shade from the desert heat. They had strolled this path many times during his recovery, sharing dreams and deepening their connection. Annie, these past weeks have shown me what I want from life, Luke began, his voice trembling with emotion. He pulled a simple gold ring from his pocket, handcrafted by the local jeweler. Will you marry me? Annie's eyes filled with joyful tears as she nodded enthusiastically. Yes, Luke, 1,000 times yes. The wedding took place 1 week later on Red Rock's Central Square, with the entire town gathered to witness the union of their beloved heroes. Since the circuit preacher was still traveling from the neighboring county, Dr. Thorne performed the ceremony with Mayor Blackwell serving as official witness. Annie wore her mother's white lace dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, while Luke stood proudly in his new deputy's uniform. Do you, Luke Cassidy, take Annie Johnson to be your lawfully wedded wife? Doc Thorne asked with a warm smile. I do, Luke replied firmly. As twilight painted the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, the celebration continued with fiddle music and dancing under a canopy of brilliant stars. Luke and Annie shared their first dance as husband and wife, while the entire community watched with approval and affection. I love you, Mrs. Cassidy, Luke whispered in Annie's ear as they swayed to the gentle melody. And I love you, Deputy Cassidy, she replied, her heart full of happiness. Their love story had begun with suspicion and danger, but it ended with trust, justice, and the promise of a bright future together in the growing town of Red Rock.